Well, this morning we come back to the patriarchs. Woohoo! By the way, patriarch, the word patriarch comes from patri, which means father, and arx, which means arch enemy would be your first or top enemy, first in line. So this is like the first fathers is what it really means, the first fathers. But I've told you last week that it's more than about the patriarchs. It's about this promise that shows up. And we saw the promise show up just last week, this promise that God gives to Abraham. And he says, this is not just a promise I'm giving to you, Abraham. This is a promise that starts with you and works its way through your descendants and up to your seed. In fact, Jeff read that this morning, Jesus himself. And then through that to all mankind. It's a promise for life from God, our Creator, to mankind. And it starts its history in Abraham. So that's why we thought, if it's that important, if really what Jesus brings in terms of abundant life and the promise of God didn't start with him, but actually started somehow with Abraham, and he's the fulfillment of it, then we need to know about Abraham, right? Right, and we're ignorant about Abraham, so we thought, well, let's go back and we'll walk our way through it and see what this is all about. Because the promise is more important than the patriarchs. I'll talk about the patriarch study, but it's really not the patriarchs and the promise, it's the promise and the patriarchs. So we're going to watch that work its way through today. So today we're in Genesis. It's easy to find out where we're going to be. It's going to be in Genesis for the next 5 months or so. So we're in Genesis 13. So you can turn there and we're going to pick up the story right here. Genesis 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. So we set the stage for today. Last week, Abram and his entire family, his whole entourage, was down in Egypt. Things didn't work out well down there in Egypt. He told Pharaoh that his wife was his sister. What? Yeah, go back and read it. It's crazy. It's in chapter 12. But now they're coming back up out of Egypt. That Egypt is not the promised land. It's not the land of promise for Abram. This land of Canaan is. So let's do a little geography right here and get you kind of squared away. Okay, we are hovering over present-day Egypt, kind of looking to the northeast. The Mediterranean on your left there. There's Cyprus, the island of Cyprus up on top. Syria, middle right, can't read that too much. Jordan. Egypt right down here. This is the Nile Delta fan that Egypt is over. And that green thing up there, that's present-day Israel. So Abraham and Sarah and Lot, his nephew, this entire entourage are down in Egypt. So as we start out chapter 13 today, they go back to the area where they're supposed to be. That's the land of Egypt. And so here's a close-up of it. We're hovering over Egypt, or over Israel. The Negev in Israel is the lower third or so of present-day Israel that is really dry as a bone. It's a desert. It's just desert. So the Negev, every time you see the word Negev, think, a desert. That doesn't help you, but it helps me some. So the Negev is the desert. That's he comes into the Negev, and he's back to the area where God wants him to be. Verse 2. Okay, now Abram was very rich in livestock and in silver and in gold. He went on his journeys from the desert, from the Negev, as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So I think I've got a graphic of this too. Yeah, okay, so they're down there in Negev. He moves up past present-day Jerusalem, up about 10 miles north of there, and you get this pair of villages called Bethel and Ai. So he's up there. Now, why does he go back there? Well, if you remember the story when we started in chapter 11 and in 12, when he came out of what is present-day Iraq and he moved down into this Canaan area, he settled right there in Bethel and Ai. And right there, he built an altar to the Lord, thanked the Lord for bringing him to this place. So he goes basically back to the place where he thanked God for bringing him to start with. So he's sort of erasing this little error of going down to Egypt and coming back, and he settles down, and now he's in this land of promise, we can call it, or what we call the promised land. You ever wonder why it was called the promised land? It's because of this promise right here. So he's back in this area, back in the center of Israel. By the way, Bethel, we talked about this last week, but Bethel will come up so many times. You got to get this in your head as well. Every time you see Beth in a word, like Bethlehem or Bethel or Beth anything, Beth is really Hebrew. It's Beit. It's Beit, and Beit means home or house. And then the thing that comes after that is the house of what? Well, Beth-El, Beit-El, house of, and El is a generic name for God. It really means in its fundamental form, power. So this is the house of God. So when Abram comes into Israel, comes to the area, he says, this is the place. This here is the house of God. Now, there's no temple here. There's no structure of anything. He's just saying that this is, in a sense, where God lives. This is where God lives, right here, Bethel. Bethlehem, 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 Bet, house of Lechem. Lechem? You don't use that all the time? Bread. It's bread. It's the house of bread. Bethlehem means house of bread. Woo! See, you guys, you're instantly Hebrew scholars. Bethlehem, you've got right there. Okay. Oh, and in fact, today, if you ever travel to Israel, you will see names of towns that are in the native tongue, and they won't say Beth, they'll say Bet. They'll say Bet everywhere you go. In fact, if you go on Google Earth, which is what this picture is from, and it shows the name of towns, it's B-E-I-T, Bet something. So it says Bethlehem. Okay. So anyway, oh boy, that's a lot of background. So the whole entourage goes back into the center of the place, figuratively speaking, where God lives for Abraham. And now we have a problem. Sheep. Now remember, it said just a second ago that Abram had a lot of livestock, a lot of silver, a lot of gold. Abram was a blessed man in many respects. But Lot also has some sheep, and this causes a problem. Verse 5. So now Lot, his nephew, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land, verse 6, could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And now, don't forget, the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land as well. So here's the problem. God has brought so much blessing to both Abram's family and his nephew Lot's family that they can't even graze their herds together because the herdsmen are kind of button heads. Now, if you go to Israel, you'll find out there's a very limited amount of water in Israel. And so many times there's fighting over water sources. Later on in our accounts, as we follow through the descendants of Abram, we'll see that a lot of the families of Abram that meet their next wives by hanging out at the water places. So the water places are a real big deal. They're a big deal. And if you've got a lot of herds and you're trying to water your herds, this can be a horrible conflict because the herdsmen finally get their sheep to come to where there's a place of water. And when they get there, someone else's sheep are there. And the sheep spook each other and it gets crazy. And I don't know, I've never herded sheep. Has anyone here herded sheep? Okay, I don't know what I'm talking about, but evidently it's a problem. My closest contact with sheep is when they walk them through town here twice a year. And that's kind of fun, too. Anyway, so we have a problem right here. We've got too much blessing from God. We've got too many sheep. And now we've got to figure out how to do it so the herdsmen don't fight each other. By the way, you notice it's not Abraham and Lot who are fighting. It's the herdsmen that are, because they're the ones that have the active day-to-day job to make this happen. So how are we going to work this kind of thing out? And then the writer of Genesis tells us, and don't forget about the fact that it's not just Lot's sheep and Abram's sheep. There's other people that live in this land, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, and they are also trying to get their sheep watered and fed. So it's a real problem. We got to figure out how to deal with this. So today's message is largely about how this is dealt with. I just had to put that picture in. They're all looking at the camera. Isn't that cool? Isn't that funny? I think probably someone shot a gun and they all looked up and they took a picture. I don't know what it was, but okay. So anyway, here's how it's going to work out. Verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, here's a solution. Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I'll go to the right, or if to the right, then I'll go to the left. So Abram comes up with a great solution. Let's just stop living so close to each other. But what's interesting about this is Abram now, Abram is, what is his relation to Lot? He's his uncle. And in a sense, he's the head of the family too. They left their old place with him now being head. As the head of the family, this is not exactly how I would put it to Lot. Would you? I mean, I would say, okay, I am your uncle Abram, and I've decided that we need to separate. So Lot, you are going there, and I am going here. Okay, bye. Right? He has the right to be able to dictate where he goes and where Lot goes. I mean, and that's not because he's a jerk. It's because that's the way the head works in the house. So, but he doesn't do that. What does he do instead? he says to Lot, he says, you know what, let's separate, and I'll let you choose. Nice guy. It's exactly my thought, too. When I read it, I thought, wow, nice guy. It's like when our kids were raising, and he would say, okay, now you make this sandwich or this, I don't know, dessert or something, and you put it on a plate, and then one of you will cut it, and then the other person gets to choose which one, right? You know how that goes? Well, that's kind of what he's doing right here. He's saying to Lot, we need to separate. That makes a lot of sense because our herdsmen are constantly fighting. I don't want to be at strife. I could dictate that they should just all get along, but I'm not going to do that. Let's just not do that. Let's separate. And Lot, you choose. Now, roll back for a second. We're not just looking at the lives of these early patriarchs. We're looking at this promise. Put it in the context of the promise. And, God has said, here's this promise. I'm going to bring you life, and I'm going to take you to a place that you've never been before, and we're going to have a society where I'm at. So this is the promise. But doesn't it look like to you, because it looked like to me, that Abram is kind of rolling dice with the promise right here. I mean, after all, what if Lot says, I'll take all of that, and it's where present-day Israel went? See, what would happen if Lot did that is that who we know as the people who lived in Moab, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who actually are descendants of Lot, they could have taken over all of Israel. Oh my gosh. I mean, is Abram actually kind of rolling dice with the promise of God? Or is he content enough with the sovereignty of God's promise that it really won't make any difference what Lot chooses? And I think that's really what it is. In a very gracious way, instead of Abram trying to control and force the promise for the best for his descendants, because he and Lot are going to separate right now, he just decides, you know what, God's in charge of this. I'll let the young man choose, and we'll see what happens. And that's what he does. It's a remarkable thing. Just like Linda said, what a nice guy. And he was. He was. Not domineering in any sense. We'll come back to this in a second when we wrap up. It's a fascinating thing. So verse 10. So Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw all the valley of the Jordan River, that it was well watered everywhere. That this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. So we need a little geography on this as well. Okay, here's our close-up right here. There's Bethel and Ai right up there. So he decides to look around and he goes, okay, I get to choose? And he looks. And he looks eastward from this spot, kind of in this area. There's my radar zone. And he looks out that direction, and he spots something interesting. He spots the Jordan River, which then, as today, flows from the Sea of Galilee in the north, and then down the Jordan through the middle of the country, down, and it empties into the Dead Sea. And today, to this very day, if you go to that area, you look at the Jordan River area, it's lush in a little zone right around it because it's wet right there. So he looks at that and he says, hey, I think that's where I want to go because I see this river valley. It looks pretty nice. Yeah, I'll go for that. That makes a lot of sense. Now, to give you a little idea about the geography of what he's looking at, when he's standing there at Bethel and Ai, he's on the top of what is kind of like a mountain ridge that runs north and south through Israel. And they're at the top of this mountain ridge. It's like a spine. And all the prominent cities just about all the prominent cities you've known about in the Old and New Testament are at the top of this mountain. And there's reasons for that. People would settle on top of mountains because they were more defensible. When bad guys were in the area, the bad guys would have to attack coming up, and that's a good position. So Jerusalem's on the top of this ridge. Bethel's on the top of this ridge. Hebron, we'll see in a second, is on the top of this ridge. And as you fall off to the west toward the Mediterranean, you see how the picture looks kind of greenish? That's because clouds come in from the west on the Mediterranean, picking up moisture. They hit this upslope as you go up, this spine of this mountain that's in the center of Israel. They hit this upslope, and then they dump all their rain. So the rain coming from the clouds in the Mediterranean actually waters the western side of this ridge. And it's pretty good looking. It's dark right there. But you get to the top of that ridge, and you go further east, the clouds run out. In fact, you can, when you go to Israel, and I'd recommend you do, you can stand on these high spots, like in Jerusalem. There's some spots in Jerusalem. You can look west to the Mediterranean. It's lush. There's palm trees. And you turn around and you look to the east down toward the Jordan River down there, and it's desolation. It's just desolation until you get to the Jordan River, and then there's finally a little bit of water because of that river. So, and we literally have done this once. You go, look at this. Ooh, look at this. So that's the way the place is marked. So that's what he's seeing. He's seeing relatively green stuff to the west toward the Mediterranean, absolute desolation, desert just to his east as he looks down to the Jordan River Valley. But in the Jordan River Valley, flowing water. So he decides that's what I'm going to pick right there. So that's what he does. There's a green spot that goes the whole length of this where things grow on both sides because you can irrigate from it, which is what he's used to in Egypt. They went down to Egypt for a short amount of time, and they said, wow, the Nile River, it's so full of water, it's incredible. Yeah, let's live someplace where there's a river where the water never stops. So he decides to go down to it. By the way, this is in elevation the lowest place on the entire earth, the Dead Sea. There's Zoar he talked about for a second. It's down at the bottom of that. And Sodom, I'm going to place on the picture here because we're going to need to know about that in a second. Sodom and Gomorrah, we're not exactly sure where it is, but it's somewhere down there. Pretty sure. We just don't know exactly where. So, verse 12. So Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. So Abram stays up on this part over here. Lot goes down in the valley where the river is, where the river Jordan is. And then the writer kind of warns us, he prefigures for us some bad stuff that's going to go down pretty soon, just a couple of chapters. And if you've heard the word Sodom and Gomorrah, you know it's probably not good, right? And sure enough, Lot is now camping himself right next to the worst place on earth. And in Hebrew, he says this very forcibly. He doesn't just say that they were sinful people that lived in Sodom. He says that they were wicked exceedingly, which means they exceeded themselves all the time in creating new ways to be wicked. That's them. And sinners against the Lord. So not a good crowd to be in, but on top of that, it's green. So we're not going to worry about it too much. So the Lord said to Abram after this, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. So he's saying the same thing to Abram now, but instead of this time Lot looking around for what he wanted, God takes Abram and says, okay, now you stand here, and you look north, and you look south, and you look east, and west, and what you see is what I'm giving to you. Wow. So in a sense, this is different from Lot. Lot was there to kind of scope out the land and see what made sense, what he wanted. What do you want? But in this particular case, God puts Abram on the spot and says, I'm not going to ask you to look around what you want. I'm going to tell you what you have. Very different kind of posture. And Abram's in this position where he's willing to receive from God what God's going to give him. And God's eager to tell him what he has already. And it's not a matter of his choice. He says, this is yours. And not only is it yours, but this is going to be for your descendants forever. Forever. And by the way, now this is an intriguing thought. According to the passage that Jeff read this morning in other parts of the New Testament, the true sons of Abraham, the true descendants of Abraham, are the ones who exhibit the same kind of qualification as Abraham did, which was living by faith in God's promises. We are them. So here's the intriguing part. Interestingly enough, according to what Scripture says, and not my own bias, it looks as though when God is saying to Abram, this land is for your descendants forever, he's talking about us as well. So in what sense is this land, this Canaan, this land of Israel, ours as well as an inheritance? We'll talk about that as time goes on. It's an intriguing thing, because certainly Abram's descendants worked their way on in history in blood, but in faith, it's us. Interesting. So that's for all of them. So 17, he does an interesting contractual thing from ancient times. Arise, walk about the land. This is God talking. Arise, walk about the land through its length and its breadth. That's up, down, left, right. For I will give it to you. And then Abraham moved his tent, came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So in ancient culture, when you're getting ready to, I'll say it this way, to mark your territory. I know that brings up other animal ideas, but we're not going to go there. But if you were to go into an area and say, this is mine. During the land rush here in the West back in the 19th century, you'd go out there in the land rush, you'd get on your pony, you'd run out to the middle of Oklahoma, you'd stick a stake in the ground on the corners, right? And you'd say, this is my property. That's how you'd circumnavigate and say, this is mine. And wherever a flag was, when someone else came out from the east to take your land, they couldn't because you had stakes around it. That's how you marked your ground. In ancient times, you marked your ground by walking it, on the periphery of it, right? You'd walk around and say, everything that I just walked around is mine. And what God's saying to Abram is, do that. Walk around this land, because everything you walk around, that is yours. That's yours. By the way, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. What did they do before the walls came tumbling down? It was their way physically of saying, you're mine, this is God's. So that's how it's done in ancient times. So Abram is given this promise by God for this place that his descendants will have forever. He walks it, he marks it, it's his. And as a part of that marking around, he decides to change where he lives. He's up in Bethel and up in Ai, and he decides to come down to a place called Hebron. Hebron's also on that ridge. It's south of Jerusalem about, 20 miles. What do you say, Scott? About 20 miles or 30? I don't know. Something like that, south of Jerusalem. It's on that ridge still, Hebron. And in fact, here's where it is right here. He moved from Bethel and Ai down to what is today the center of the lower lobe of the West Bank, Hebron right there. And is that a famous place? To this day, actually, you can go there. If you go there, you'll see this, Abraham's tomb. Yes, Abraham's tomb. Abraham's tomb. It's celebrated by the Muslims for sure. In fact, this is a place, we'll look when we find Abraham dying. There's a land that is bought to bury him. It's a cave, actually, and it's right here in Hebron. By all accounts we have, buried here is not only just Abraham, but his wife, Sarah, as well as Isaac and Rebekah, his son and daughter-in-law, as well as Jacob and Leah, one of his wives. So it's a big place. I was here 40 years ago. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, I was 40 years ago, I guess. I was here, and by the way, you can't go in there today. It's a very contentious West Bank Palestinian city. I don't know of any tour guides that take people into Hebron anymore because it's like that. But this is very sacred if this is Abraham's tomb. But I remember going into this place. It was the only place that I visited back 40 years ago in the land of Israel where we got there and people started shouting at us and yelling at us, and I thought we were in danger. And I didn't know what they were saying. It was because we must have looked disrespectful for Abraham's tomb. So that's what it is. So that's to this very day, the people who trace their beginnings back to Abraham in Hebron do it at his tomb. I'll just make this a small point. The Bible is historical, and it has historical touch places. It has cities that really exist, have people that to this very day call the cities the same thing they did so long ago. And they celebrate and venerate the people who were buried there so long ago. So when we talk about Abraham, when we talk about the patriarchs, we're not talking about a story that's fiction. It's real. And to this very day, you can go there and look at it. It's real. So I just needed to rub that in for a second because of the obvious contrast in our area here. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to do some closing observations, and that's the whole story for this morning. And let me just point out a few things. Separation is often necessary, even amongst people that love themselves. And separation, the way that Abram did it with Lot, I think is fascinating. There are times in which inside the Christian church we get on each other's nerves or things grow and change. And many times it looks like, I think the simplest and most peaceful way to resolve this is just to put some distance between us. But in the Christian realm, many times what we do is we do this gimme, gimme, mine kind of thing. Say, okay, I think it's time for us to separate, but I'm taking this and you get whatever's left over. Bye. Right? It's like those gulls in that animation. Mine. And so in Christian realms, though, we ought to be really more like Abram in a sense, to say separation's a good thing. Now, we've just outgrown our ability to both coexist here. And many times there's nothing wrong with that. There wasn't animosity between Lot and between his uncle Abram. There wasn't. But there was just a reality. And in that sense, what I really love about Abram, because he was such a nice guy, he said, you pick. Take whatever you need. Let's just do that. Now, there's a famous pastor I've read about his biography many times. He comes from England in the 19th century. He had the same thing happen in their church. Their church had grown up. It had kind of split in a way. It was over in Bristol, England, which is about a 4-hour drive west of London. And there the church grew up. They split into two pieces because they basically just got too big to do things together. But the amazing thing is that in the history of that particular church, a conflict came up because they said after they split, the lead people that left said, you know what, I think we really deserve that church building and not you. So you need to vacate and we're going to use that building. Now they said this to the pastor who stayed behind, the pastor who rose up both congregations. The people who left came back and said, this building's ours. You need to vacate. Now that pastor from all rights as the leader of both congregations originally should have been able to put his foot down and say, I don't think so. But you know what he did? He said, okay, here. And he vacated. Now the story goes on much longer years later where those congregations became best friends. But the interesting thing is that he did what Abram did. He said, oh, okay, here, just take what you think you need. And he gave their whole church building away. That's not very characteristic in the Christian church, but it ought to be. Because Abram was a man who lived inside the promises of God rather than trying to control the outcome for his best. He allowed God to take care of that. And he said, okay, you choose. You choose. And I think that's just an important point. We don't want that to go past quickly. Second point here is that God did let Lot choose. He's the one. You decide what you want to do and how you want to do it. And basically, I'll settle with what God gives me. Now, another thing that's interesting about this is that Lot's reaction didn't make sense to me. I mean, not from a respectful sense, it didn't. If I was writing the Bible, I know you're tired of me saying that. If I was writing the Bible and Lot was such a godly young man, what would have happened was Abraham, in his niceness, would say, you choose. And Lot would, if he was a good guy, what would he do? No. Oh, I'm so honored by you, Uncle Abraham. He's just a wonderful guy. No. He should have at least a little bit put up a little bit of a respectful fight. Don't you think? Oh, you're so good to me. You choose. Right? Isn't that what he should have done? But he doesn't. It gives you a clue into Lot's kind of thinking in that particular sense. He's thinking, that. Right? That's exactly what he did. It's not going to turn out well for Lot, by the way. If you want to read forward, you'll be amazed at what happened. It just does not turn out well. Even though he's making a pretty good choice in many respects, he's not making the best choice because he chose based on what he could see rather than what he knew about the promises of God. And this is a key point. This is a really key point. You remember as we were reading the passage? It said he looked down, he saw the river Jordan right there. And what did he say? He said, it's like the land of Egypt, which has the river Nile. He's seeing things and saying, well, that looks like the place that we weren't supposed to go to, but hey, they've got it pretty good right there, and this is like that, so hey, that seems to make sense to me. Let's just do that. We'll go down there. And that choice, because he based it sheerly on what he could recognize, and he wasn't being an idiot about this. He saw green areas down there. It seems to make a lot of sense. Egypt worked well like that. I don't know why it wouldn't work well here in the Jordan River Valley. Even to this very day, the country of Jordan, which borders just to the east of the Jordan River is like the dividing line. That's the eastern edge of Israel. Jordan starts right after that. The huge majority of all the fresh produce that's grown for the country of Jordan is grown right next to the Jordan River. It's right there. It's right there. So to this day, it's very much like that. So it's not a stupid choice he made, but it is a choice where he preferred what he could see over what the promise of God was. I think if he was really a very godly young man, he would have said to his uncle, Uncle, I appreciate what you're doing, allowing me to choose. What a great honor you do me. But the whole reason we're in this country is because God has called you here, and by his leading and his promise we're here. Uncle, where should we be? I mean, we can separate some, but where should we be? Based on, where's the center of God's promises for us? That's what he should have said. But instead he said, that looks pretty good. And we do that often as well. It's not as though our vision's impaired, but the problem is that when we look at something, we say, that would work for me, I'll do that. That looks like it's a really good deal. I'm going to grab onto that. Mine. That's mine. I'm going to control that, and that's going to be part of my future. That will guarantee happiness for me because what I see will guarantee happiness for me. I'll control this at all costs. Instead of saying, but you know what? God's got a plan for me as well. Yeah, that could be one of the good options. It could be. And I'll pray about that. But I don't want to leave out of the picture the fact that there may be more than meets the eye in the decision that's in front of me. There may be more coming from the promise and plan of God that's here that I don't see. And so many times you'll hear us talk about the fact, well, this opportunity was presented before us. You know, when I make my pro and con list, it seems pretty good. It looks pretty pro. My eyes see this, and I go, that's okay. But, stop the truck. We need to ask God if there's more than meets the eye here. We need to ask him if this is in the center of his promise for us, or are we just trying to control and manipulate our own future for what we think is our good? Maybe we need to see what God thinks is for us. Where's the center of his promises for us? And we do that not only as a church, but individually we need to do that. When you're on these kinds of decisions and they're placed before you, it's responsible to use all the faculties God has given you to see and to perceive and to weigh. There's nothing wrong with that. But then you also have to give assent to the fact there's more than your sight can see, and there's more wisdom than your brain can devise. And so we go to God at the same time and say, well, God, this is what I see. I think this would be good for us. It makes sense in so many ways. But I want to be in the center of what your plan is for me. I want to be in the center of what your promise is for me. Am I missing that? So to the same degree I've used my eyes and my mind to think through this and see this, I'm going to stop and pray and use the eyes of my heart to listen where you want me to be. And that's part and parcel to every Christian decision that should ever be made. Now you're saying, well, what if you make that prayer and God doesn't come with some big shout from heaven, Jim, I've heard your prayer. You need to, on December 23rd. And he doesn't do anything overt. I mean, there is no flashes. There's no email from God. Then what are you supposed to do? Have you ever been there? I have. Now, I have to qualify this. There's been times where God has sent email, figuratively speaking. I mean, where he's been actually very, very, very clear. But many times he's not. And at those times where he's not, it's enough for me to have said, God, I want what you want, not just what I want. I want to be in the center of your promises, not in the middle of my intentions for myself. Many times God's saying, great, that's all I've been waiting for. But then at that point I say, but God, you know what? I'm going to go this way, and if that's really boneheaded wrong, I'll give you permission to just turn me around any second. But this is the way I'm going to go, and here we go. Now, the amazing thing is you'd say, well, it sounds like God's dead or he's uninvolved in your life or something like that. I don't think so. I think in large measure what God is doing to us is he's training us to sort of think like him and to listen to him and develop tighter dependence on him, saying, take me where I need to go. So in many respects, and I know this is true, it's as though God is saying, okay, I heard your request, but Jim, what do you think? And you wrestle over it. And you wrestle over God's agenda for a place and God's plan for a place and how he wants to use you in it. And suddenly you're putting him in the center of that. You're saying, well, God, not for my good, but for your good, let's go this way. And if that's just really stupid, God, I'm waiting for you to change my mind. I'm waiting for you to change the course. And the amazing thing is that when he allows me to choose, he gets me to where he wants me to be. I don't get that. Because it's happened many, many times. He is sovereign over those things because the issue in all of this is to say, God, not my will, but yours be done. I'm going to go this way today. Change me if it's wrong. Because I want what's for you, not what's for me. And I think that's the actual walking by faith element. That's what we're talking about. Abram chose to receive whatever God had promised. He didn't try and talk Lot out of his choice. He didn't look down and say, oh, you're right, that's a pretty good looking river down there. I don't think so, Lot. You're not going to do that. He doesn't. He lets him have the choice. And Abram just decides, whatever God gives me, that's in the center of his promise for me. And it's even sovereign over Lot's choice. Go figure. He decides to accept what God's going to give to him. And he doesn't go out necessarily taking. And yet God does say to him, this is all yours. Mark it off. It's yours. It's already given to you. It's yours. So Abram decides to stay in the middle of God's plan rather than try and weigh the pros and cons of the geography and the land and the westward slopes of all those clouds. And he doesn't do all that stuff. God says, this is it, walk it, it's yours. Now remember, earlier in the passage, he said that there were Canaanites and Perizzites in the land. But Abram's walking it off as though it belongs to God. Whew. So in Abram's mind, he's thinking, how is this going to happen? I'm just a small band of family that came from Ur in Mesopotamia, and we're in the midst of this area where Canaanites have been living for a long time, where Perizzites have been living a long time, and there's also Jebusites there and Hittites. I could go down a whole list of people who are there. How is it that I can walk this land and act like, in a sense, I'm owning this for God? God, this is a recipe for war. You just don't come into someone else's area and say, this is ours. But this is a land of promise that God has given to him and has promised him and his descendants for a long time. And yes, the Canaanites will be taken care of, and yes, the Perizzites will be taken care of, and on down the list, Jebusites. One little thing I wanted to show you, and if you're studying Deuteronomy with the ladies, you're going to run into this. Because this is an interesting piece of geographical tidbit about this whole choice thing. Deuteronomy 11:10. He's giving them a clue about how peculiar this land is. Remember I said they live up on the top of this ridge? For the land into which you are entering to possess it, it's not like the land of Egypt. Remember what Lot said? Looks like Egypt. No, this land he's giving is not like Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot, like a vegetable garden. You know what it means to water it with your foot? They had foot-activated pumps to irrigate. So they'd be next to the Nile, and the Nile would flood out wide and put alluvial soil on the side, but you still needed to pump water out of the Nile. And so the slaves did this all day long. They irrigated. It was foot-pumping irrigation. It's not like where you water it with your foot like a vegetable garden, but the land into which you're about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven. A land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning even to the end of the year. So by God's design, he's saying, I don't want you to live down by that river, to do that Nile thing with the Jordan. And that's not what I've got planned for you. I want you to live on the top of this ridge, this mountaintop. Well, where's the water going to come from on the top of a mountain? There, from rain. And so all throughout the entire Old Testament, when you see them start to occupy the land, they'll talk about the fact that rain and dew is the presence of God seeing to our daily needs. Why? Because if it doesn't rain and the dew doesn't come on the top of that mountain, your garden dies. It was a way in which God said, I want you to be dependent on me all the time. And I'll be faithful. And what's his commitment on the bottom? I'm never going to fall asleep. I'm always on top of this from the beginning even to the end of the year. Every season, the rain that comes down from heaven is something I'm going to bring, and it's going to draw you closer to me as we do this. And as a result, it's not a small thing when Israel sins, when drought comes. Because it's God's way of saying, this water doesn't come for free. It comes because of my loving kindness for you. You don't want any of me? You don't want me anymore? No water. Because it's always been meant to be a connection to God himself. It's no mystery why in Egypt, with the Nile River, so many of their gods were tied up with the Nile River, because it brings life. This is a very common kind of thought. So God says, I want you to live on top of this peak. I want you to be dependent on me for water to water your garden. And the dew that comes at night, it's water from God that sneaks in while you're sleeping. It's a wonderful picture of God's gentle but ever-present care. Look at the dew on these leaves. God was here. He's watered our gardens even while we were sleeping. Is that cool or what? So that's imagery you'll see all through the Old Testament by God's design. I want you to live on this peak. I want you to depend on me, and I'll be like the dew of heaven. I'll be like the rain from heaven, and I'll provide for you. So in some way, Abraham doesn't really understand this, but that's what he's chosen to receive, is what God has promised from that particular perspective. And I'll close with this. Paul writes this, right? We quote this all the time. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Lot and Abram today had to make a choice. Who walked by faith? Who walked by sight? See, that's why this story is here. You have Lot, who walked by sight, who said, that looks good, looks like Egypt. And that's going to be a ruinous decision in a couple chapters. Sodom and Gomorrah. Looks pretty good to me. And then there's Abram who said, I'm going to walk by faith. Now remember I said last week, and I keep saying this all through this, faith is something that's erected. It stands on fact or promise. And in Abram's case, it's erected on promise. God's made a promise. And by faith, he says, God, I'll just take whatever's in the center of your promise. By faith, I hold your word to that. That's where I want to be. And that's why he is such a prototype of faith for us. He's someone who, despite everything else, decided to say, I, above everything else, will stay in the center of God's promise for me. And I'll hold God to that. That's faith. It stands on that promise. And God says, I'll never be bad on that promise. Take it to the bank. Just like he says in the land of Israel, when the rains come, I'll be watching it 24/7, 365. I'll do it. For us, that's the true followers of God. People who take God at his promise for abundant life, leaving behind the one life for a life swap to be a life with him. And we say, God, I want to be in the center of your promises. Your loving kindness to me never ends, and it's backed up by all the resources of heaven. I walk by faith in your promises. And when my sight tells me that everything's wrong and everything's fallen apart, I'll remind myself that I'm still in the center of your promises, and everything works together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. That's what faith is. And Abram's going to be our prototype for the next several months. Okay? Okay, let's pray. Father, we do indeed thank you for this story and putting in black and white the difference between walking by faith and walking by sight. And Lord, I'm encouraged as I think forward in the life of Lot. Boy, things get tough, really tough. And yet even still, you redeem in the midst of our bad decisions. You've redeemed us as we sit here in the midst of our bad decisions in life, things that looked like they made sense, but in the living them out, they really didn't. There was more hidden from our view than we could ever see. And Lord, you have been so gracious to us in the midst of our silly choices, to still yet come around and bring life. Lord, we want so much to be in the center of your promises to us, your promise of abundant life, this promise that starts with Abraham and works its way all the way through Christ to us right now. And Lord, as we veer off of that, as we start thinking about how to control our own lives and gimme, mine, and take for myself and ensure happiness for myself, I pray you gently take our hands off of that control and say, God, well, not what I will, but you will. I'm yours. I'm yours. So thank you for your great loving kindness to us that persists even beyond our silliness, this love that has no dimension, and this promise that's the fulfillment of that love in reality. So thank you for all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
To finish this morning, I want to pull together 3 ideas from the